High-priced talent far better than me talking to SAFE and PBOC and the State Council about how do you diversify your foreign exchange reserves. So I think that's my first point is where is the expertise in the government to decide what we're going to do with this money. And my second was, why do you leave it in cash securities? Why don't you do something else with it? So in 2007 you saw that China Investment Corporation was established. This is the China's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it has $200 billion under its management. So this is the first time they've moved away from simple securities and into something that could be much more interesting. And you can be sure that that was a result of a lot of high-priced education by the Western banks as well. It was a good idea, but it was the wrong time. So you remember the first investment of CIC was Blackstone Partners IPO. Next investment was Morgan Stanley. There's a book in China that's very popular right now called China is Not Happy. 中国不高兴. You can begin to get an idea of why they're not so happy. But the bureaucratic consequence, I think, is even more serious than just these two bad investments. After all, I assume that the expertise that Morgan Stanley and the Blackstone Partners have will result in an improved stock price over some period of time, and get their principal back anyway. But the bureaucratic consequence of CIC's formation, I think, created tensions with SAFE, which is the foreign exchange regulator, and which had been responsible, as you will remember maybe, for managing part of the foreign exchange reserves. And it challenged them in effect, and they went out and accumulated a huge investment in overseas equities. If at the end of 2006 they had approximately $4 billion in non-renminbi equities in their portfolio. At the end of last year, or at the end of 2007, it was $100 billion, and the estimates are in the market that they lost over $80 billion of this last year during the last quarter. So you can begin to also understand why the Chinese might be so excited in participating in the recapitalization of American banks. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that it is not so easy to say, you've got $2 trillion, let's go out and use it. You need to have the expertise. And the short time frame in which they've gathered this money after 30 years of hard work at reform and opening suggests that they have a way to go. Right now, Premier Wen's asking for guarantees. Vice Premier Wang Qishan, who is arguably one of the more knowledgeable financial experts in the government, aside from the head of the PBOC, Dr. Zhou Xiaotuan, he no longer believes that capital markets possibly are a solution to China's problems. Liu Mingkang, who runs the banking regulator, just spent the last 7 years fighting with Chinese banks to try and get them to implement the American model of banking and risk management. What do you think his position is in this picture now? Just my closing point on this is that the Chinese in 1979, as they began to grapple with the opening and reform, tried to find a model that they could go along with. And you know, we all know that Deng Xiaoping said one step at a time across the river. But the model which they adopted was the Anglo-Saxon financial market, consumer, business model. And now they see it has been a false god, or at least that's what they think. So that's my first point. Let's talk about China's banks. So after all, if China's going to save the world, then its financial institutions must be the ones that are going to save it. China is very proud of having a number of companies, 33 in the Fortune 500. If you look at the table on the top there, you'll see that by market cap, China, ICBC, or Industrial Commercial Bank of China, is the largest bank in the world in terms of market capitalization. And it's number 2 in the Fortune 500 after ExxonMobil. But what does this really mean? If you look at the second chart there, you can see that China, or ICBC, has a 201 billion market cap. There's its total number of shares. It's listed in Hong Kong, it's listed in Shanghai, and 29.3% of its total number of shares has been listed, which means that 70% of the shares are not listed. They're owned by Beijing. So how do we get to the 201 billion market cap? We take the price in Hong Kong and multiply it times the total number of shares, whether they're listed or not. If you look there, JPMorgan is number 19. It has a market cap of $125 billion, but 100% of its shares are unlisted. So when you talk about JPMorgan's market capitalization, or Citibank's, or Wells Fargo, or Bank of America, 100% of their shares are listed in the New York Stock Exchange. And when you do a market capitalization calculation, you will get a true value for the company. But I would argue that for ICBC, as well as for all the 33 companies listed in the Fortune 500 for China, this is the same case. So these banks are not as big as they look. What has been the mission of these banks? And Gene, you're going to tell me to shut up here. Do I got 5? Okay. What has been the mission? The mission of these banks, as so adequately described, has been to pump out money to the state sector. If you ask local governments to give you a few projects to invest in, they're going to come up with everything. They will definitely give you projects. They may not be good projects, but they will be good projects. There will be projects there for sure. So in the first quarter of this year alone, I think it is easy to conclude that if you lend the entire amount of money that you lent in the last year in 3 months, that there's probably not a really great risk control mechanism in those banks. I would say they just pump that money out like it was water to put out a fire. And I would also say that the 7 years of work that have been put in by Bank of America, by RBS, and other strategic investors in the Chinese banks over the last 7 years to make them more international has probably been washed away by that flood of loans. These banks, I believe, have returned to their original character as state-owned entities. Are these banks international? I think we all know the answer to that. They have a few branches internationally. ICBC and CCB just opened their offices in New York. But they are not particularly international. Out of their Hong Kong treasuries, they tend to fund, they do participate in the more sophisticated financial markets, but only for their own customer bases. They are not lending to anyone internationally except for the multinationals in China. So recently, the chairman and CEO of China Merchants Bank, which is arguably a real bank in China, made the comment that Chinese banks have been very lucky to have escaped the global financial crisis. But their escape has been merely a function of the fact that they are not exposed globally. I was going to talk a little bit about the quality of the banking assets, given the amount of money that's been spent the last quarter. You may remember that 10 years ago this year, in the run-up to the listing of these companies, except for the Agricultural Bank of China in Hong Kong, 4 bad banks or asset management companies were set up. That just simply means that that $1 billion they're investing in the AMCs are going to be used to pay back them off, and that these banks are basically repossessing the problem loans they never got rid of in the first place. So, what are we really talking about when we talk about banks? What are we talking about when we talk about China? As Barry has talked about, it is an emerging market. It has played a much larger role in the last decade than it has before. It is heading in the right direction, and it's very important. But it's only been a very young participant in the markets. And its banks are still yet to really emerge in the international economy. And in order to try to avoid the impact of the crisis in the domestic economy, the overwhelming pile of loans that have been put out in the last 3 months have threatened the reforms of the banking system that have been made over the last 7 years. That's my comments, and I hope that provokes some conversation. Thank you all very much.